They thought the mountain was dead, silent, harmless, a dark giant asleep above the glittering villas and vineyards of the Bay of Naples. But on a single August day in 79 AD, the sky tore open. Noon became night. The air itself turned to stone. First came the hail of pumice, white daggers falling without end, crushing roofs, breaking bones. Then came the ash, heavy, choking, blinding. Streets disappeared. Voices smothered mid-scream. And when the mountain's heart finally burst, fire raced down its slopes. Not flames, but surges of molten air, hotter than iron, faster than any fleeing soul. Herculaneum vanished in an instant. Bodies boiled in silence. Pompeii followed, entombed in layers of death, a city frozen in its final breath. What remained was no ruin, no rubble, but a trap, a perfect prison of time, sealing frescoes, bread, pets, prayers, terror itself. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell while Vesuvius held its secret, smoldering in the earth, hiding a chapter too complete, too raw, too damning. When the ground finally yielded, it was not history that emerged, but a mirror, showing us the fragility of power, the arrogance of permanence, and the cruel precision with which nature erases certainty. The Bay of Naples in the 1st century AD was a land that seemed untouchable, as if blessed by the gods themselves. Its volcanic soil was among the most fertile in the Roman world, producing wines, olives, and grains that fed both local markets and distant provinces. Grapevines climbed in neat rows across the countryside, and orchards thrived in abundance, each harvest reinforcing the belief that this corner of Italy was chosen for prosperity. Villas lined the shorelines and hillsides, built by wealthy Romans who sought respite from the relentless politics of Rome. The bay, with its sweeping curve and calm waters, was a magnet for commerce and pleasure alike. Ships carried goods into its harbors, while senators and aristocrats built grand estates overlooking the sea. To live in Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabii, or Oplontis was to live at the center of wealth, culture, and leisure, a place where fortune and beauty converged. Pompeii was no mere town. It was a city alive with noise and ambition. Its forum was the beating heart of civic life, surrounded by temples, markets, and public buildings that proclaimed its status as a Roman colony. Amphitheaters and theaters echoed with voices, from gladiatorial contests to public gatherings. Taverns, bakeries, and bathhouses stood on nearly every street. Its population, estimated at around 12,000 to 15,000 people by 79 AD, represented a cross-section of Roman society: senators and local magistrates, merchants enriched by trade, artisans shaping bronze and pottery, farmers tied to the volcanic fields, and enslaved people who sustained the engines of prosperity. Pompeii's walls were marked with graffiti ranging from political slogans to advertisements and personal declarations, evidence of a vibrant, outspoken community. Herculaneum, smaller but no less important, stretched along the coast just north of Pompeii. It was famed for its villas, especially those of the elite who sought the bay's breezes and the tranquility of the seaside. The Villa of the Papyri, a sprawling complex filled with marble statues and a library of charred scrolls that would later tantalize historians, belonged to the family of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, Julius Caesar's father-in-law. Herculaneum's population, likely around 4,000 to 5,000 people, enjoyed a life of refinement, benefiting from proximity to Naples while maintaining its own character. Its streets, narrower than those of Pompeii, suggested a community oriented more toward residential grandeur than bustling commerce. Stabii, situated further south, had a different character altogether. It was a retreat, a collection of luxurious seaside villas perched on cliffs overlooking the water. Roman elites sought out Stabii not for business or trade, but for leisure, healing, and the fresh air believed to restore health. Here, large complexes with colonnades and gardens offered panoramic views, a stark contrast to the commercial intensity of Pompeii. Oplontis, near modern Torre Annunziata, contained one of the most spectacular examples of Roman architecture in the Villa Poppaea, believed to be connected to the family of the Empress Poppaea Sabina, wife of Nero. These estates reflected the sheer concentration of wealth that the Bay of Naples had drawn into its orbit by the late 1st century. All of it lay in the shadow of a mountain few thought of as dangerous. Mount Vesuvius, towering over the plain, was covered in vineyards and dotted with small settlements. Its slopes produced wines that were shipped across the empire, praised by poets and merchants alike. Martial and Pliny the Elder both noted the quality of its produce. Roman perception of the mountain was shaped by its silence. It had not erupted in recorded history, and its long dormancy rendered it benign in the eyes of those who lived beneath it. Generations had passed without memory of fire or ash. To the farmers cultivating its sides, the mountain was not a threat, but a provider. The soil's richness was its gift, its stillness a promise. Yet geology tells a different story. Vesuvius had not been asleep, it had only been waiting. Its last major eruption before 79 AD had occurred thousands of years earlier, during the Bronze Age, long before Rome existed. Those prehistoric explosions had shaped the landscape, forming the cone that now loomed over the bay. But to the Romans, with no written record of those catastrophes, the volcano appeared inert. Their understanding of natural phenomena was framed through myth and religion, not through the science that would later define volcanology. Earthquakes, landslides, and subterranean rumbles were attributed to the moods of gods or the disturbances of giants imprisoned beneath the earth. The very signs that foretold disaster were misread, dismissed, or forgotten. This blindness was not without warning. In 62 AD, a powerful earthquake struck the region, causing widespread destruction. Temples crumbled, houses collapsed, and Pompeii itself suffered severe damage. Reconstruction efforts lingered for years, with buildings still under repair when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. But to the inhabitants, the earthquake was an isolated calamity, not a precursor. The region was known for tremors, and rebuilding was an accepted part of life. When lesser shocks rattled the ground in the years that followed, they were treated as nuisances, not portents. Life pressed on, confident in the permanence of Roman order. The Bay of Naples was more than a landscape. It was a hub of culture, a magnet for Rome's elite. The poet Statius celebrated its beauty, and the wealthy Roman aristocracy considered it a retreat as vital as it was fashionable. Naples itself, a Greek-founded city, infused the area with Hellenistic culture, theater, and learning. The entire Gulf stood as a crossroads of Roman and Greek traditions, layered with centuries of history. To walk its streets was to walk within the heart of empire, where marble columns, painted walls, and tiled mosaics testified to Rome's wealth and ambition. The geography only reinforced the illusion of permanence. The bay formed a natural crescent, offering protection to ships and supporting trade routes across the Mediterranean. The fertile plains stretching inland were dotted with farms, their produce feeding not only local populations, but also the vast networks of Rome's commerce. Every aspect of the terrain encouraged growth, encouraged permanence, encouraged complacency. The mountain, silent and green, did nothing to betray its hidden power. And so Pompeii thrived, Herculaneum gleamed, Stabii rested, and Aplantis dazzled with its villas. The people moved through their days unaware that beneath their feet, pressure was mounting. The land that had given them abundance had been built upon fire. The vineyards grew on slopes of ash, the harbors edged into lava-formed shores. The great mountain that stood above them was not simply a backdrop. It was a loaded force, a buried history waiting to erupt. Generations lived and died in its shadow, convinced of its safety. Markets rang with noise, ships sailed in and out of harbors, and amphitheaters filled with crowds. Inscriptions carved into stone promised political futures, contracts of business, and pledges of love. The city's walls bore witness to ambitions, rivalries, and fleeting moments of human expression. And all the while, Vesuvius stood over them, its silence a mask, its slopes a deception. The Bay of Naples before disaster was a world at its peak, certain of its permanence, unaware that beneath its vineyards and marble villas, the earth was preparing to rewrite its history in ash and fire. Pompeii in the 1st century AD was a Roman city pulsing with life, a place where every street and square bore witness to the relentless energy of a society at its height. The Forum, set at the city's heart, was more than a political center. It was the place where religion, commerce, and authority intersected. Temples rose around it, the Temple of Jupiter dominating the northern edge, the Temple of Apollo speaking to older Italic traditions, and the Temple of Vespasian honoring the emperor himself. Statues of magistrates and benefactors stood in rows, reminders that civic pride was bound to both religion and politics. Markets surrounded the space, selling produce from the fertile fields outside the walls, while the basilica, with its grand hall and colonnades, hosted the business of contracts and justice. To stand in the Forum of Pompeii in 79 AD was to stand in the beating core of a Roman colony that had become indistinguishable from Rome itself. Entertainment defined civic life. The amphitheater of Pompeii, completed around 70 BC, was the oldest surviving stone amphitheater in the Roman world. It could seat approximately 20,000 spectators, more than the city's own population, drawing crowds from surrounding towns. Gladiatorial games filled its tiers, brutal contests sponsored by wealthy citizens seeking both prestige and influence. In 59 AD, a riot between Pompeians and spectators from Mysia was so violent that the Senate in Rome intervened, banning games in the amphitheater for a decade. That episode revealed how deeply the culture of spectacle had rooted itself in Pompeii, to the point of political upheaval. Alongside the amphitheater stood a palestra, a training ground for youth, with its central pool and colonnaded courts, where exercise and education intertwined. Theaters, too, flourished. The large theater hosted plays and performances in the Roman style, while the smaller Odeon accommodated musical and poetic recitals. Culture, violence, and politics were not separate spheres. They fed into each other, shaping a public life that thrived on visibility. Beyond public spaces, private life told its own story. Pompeii's villas and houses, arranged in a complex grid of streets, reflected the spectrum of Roman society. The House of the Faun, sprawling across an entire city block, boasted mosaics of Alexander the Great and sprawling courtyards designed for grandeur. The Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the city walls, preserved frescoes depicting initiation rituals into the cult of Dionysus, religion intertwined with household life in vivid color. Smaller domus homes housed artisans and shopkeepers, their workshops opening directly onto the streets, their living spaces tucked behind. Taverns, or thermopolia, served hot food and wine, their counters embedded with jars for stew and drinks, providing a communal space for the working classes. Bathhouses, both public and private, structured daily routine. The Stabian baths, among the oldest in Pompeii, contained separate facilities for men and women, heated by sophisticated hypocaust systems that circulated warm air beneath floors and through walls. To enter these spaces was to encounter both luxury and routine necessity, where hygiene, leisure, and social exchange merged seamlessly. The lifeblood of Pompeii was its economy. Agriculture was its foundation, fed by the volcanic soil that sustained vineyards and olive groves. The region's wine was renowned across the empire. Amphorae stamped with inscriptions found in Pompeii reveal an extensive trade network stretching to Gaul, Spain, and beyond. Olive oil production, essential to cooking and lighting, further enriched the countryside. Grain fields supplemented the diet, but the emphasis on vines and olives reflected a calculated pursuit of profit. Within the city, fullers' workshops processed cloth, their vats filled with urine collected for cleaning and bleaching textiles. Bakeries, equipped with stone mills and ovens, supplied bread daily, grinding flour with donkeys and slaves. Fish sauce, garum, produced in nearby coastal towns, was another key export, filling amphorae that carried its pungent taste to kitchens throughout Rome. The sea itself was an artery of wealth. Pompeii's proximity to the Sarno River and the Bay of Naples allowed goods to flow in and out with ease. Harbors teemed with activity, from fishermen hauling catches to merchants securing shipments bound for Rome. Every trade, every craft, every shipment reinforced Pompeii's status as a thriving urban hub. Herculaneum, though smaller and quieter, was no less significant. It was a retreat, a town shaped less by commerce and more by luxury. Built along the coastline, its villas commanded views over the sea, with terraces that seemed to extend directly into the waters of the bay. Its architecture favored elegance, with mosaics and frescoes that displayed both wealth and refinement. Wealthy Romans, often from the senatorial class, maintained residences there, using it as a seasonal refuge from the intensity of political life. Streets in Herculaneum were narrower, its scale more intimate than Pompeii's, yet its prosperity was evident in its houses and public buildings. Shops and workshops served the needs of residents, but the town's essence was leisure, supported by the same fertile hinterland that enriched the entire region. Society in Pompeii and Herculaneum was layered, complex, and unmistakably Roman. Patricians and local elites commanded the highest status, their power rooted in land ownership, political office, and public benefaction. Many were connected to Rome's ruling class, securing influence through wealth and networks. Merchants and traders occupied a crucial middle ground, their fortunes rising through the sale of wine, textiles, or imported goods. Artisans, craftsmen, and shopkeepers formed the practical backbone of the cities, producing the goods that sustained daily life. Slavery was ever present, woven into the fabric of society. Enslaved laborers worked in fields, kitchens, and workshops. They maintained the grand villas and powered the economy that allowed their owners to flourish. Freedmen, once enslaved but later emancipated, played an increasingly visible role. Many became prosperous themselves, running businesses and sponsoring public works, their tombs often displaying inscriptions that boasted of both hardship endured and status achieved. This mixture of patrician pride, mercantile ambition, artisanal skill, and enslaved labor created a society that was at once rigid in hierarchy and fluid in opportunity. Religion infused every corner of life. Household shrines, or lauraria, decorated homes with painted images of household gods, often placed in kitchens or courtyards. Public temples honored a pantheon that linked the city directly to Rome's imperial authority. Cults, both official and foreign, found a place in Pompeii. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, drew devotees with its promise of renewal and eternal life, its temple lavishly reconstructed after the earthquake of 62 AD. Such religious practices reflected both tradition and adaptation, showing a society eager to honor the gods while embracing new influences. To walk the streets of Pompeii before 79 AD was to encounter the full range of Roman civilization compressed into a single space. Stone-paved streets bore ruts from carts. Stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross without soaking their sandals in waste, and water fountains stood at regular intervals, fed by aqueducts that channeled fresh water into the city. Graffiti covered walls with political slogans, poetry, crude jokes, and personal rivalries, unfiltered voices of a society alive and restless. Everything in Pompeii and Herculaneum reflected a world that believed in its continuity, a world that lived fully in the present while leaving behind fragments that would one day speak louder than any words. The Roman world of Pompeii was not exceptional because it was unique. It was exceptional because it was ordinary, a complete portrait of urban life in the empire, preserved at its zenith without the knowledge that its days were numbered. In 62 AD, the ground beneath Campania convulsed with a force that stunned the Roman world. The earthquake that struck the Bay of Naples shattered temples, cracked walls, and toppled columns across Pompeii and Herculaneum. The event was so violent that it was remembered decades later by Seneca the Younger, who described it in his Natural Questions, not as the work of shifting earth, but as the wrath of nature itself, a phenomenon he sought to explain with philosophy rather than geology. Pompeii's forum was torn apart, statues fell, and houses collapsed into rubble. Herculaneum's coastline shifted, altering the line where land met the sea. The destruction was immense, yet the interpretation was rooted not in scientific causality, but in cultural understanding, an act of the gods, a punishment, or a divine warning. For those who survived, it was a disaster to endure and rebuild from, not a signal of something larger looming beneath the soil. The reconstruction after 62 AD was slow and uneven. Pompeii's walls bore scaffolding for years, some buildings permanently abandoned while others were restored in stages. The Temple of Isis, beloved by many, was rebuilt through the benefaction of a wealthy freedman's family, its frescoes shining anew even as cracks still scarred other structures nearby. The city's amphitheater remained scarred by damage, yet the games eventually returned, testifying to the resilience of civic pride. Herculaneum, though less visibly shattered, also bore marks of repair. But the significance of the earthquake, the warning it might have carried, faded as daily life reasserted itself. Earthquakes were not unknown to Romans. Italy's peninsula was prone to them. They were accepted as part of existence, an inconvenience, sometimes a terror, but never a clear sign of volcanic danger. In the years that followed, tremors persisted. They were reminders, sudden jolts that rattled amphorae from shelves or sent cracks running along plaster walls, but they did not halt life. Instead, they became part of the rhythm of the region, absorbed into its identity as much as its fertile soil and bustling harbors. Romans lacked the concept of tectonic plates or subterranean magma chambers. For them, the earth moved because gods shifted, because divine powers stirred beneath the ground. Neptune, god of the sea and earthquakes, was often invoked, his power feared but not understood in scientific terms. A violent tremor could be interpreted as an omen tied to politics, religion, or personal fate rather than the mechanics of geology. By August of 79 AD, these tremors had intensified. Minor shocks shook the ground daily, a pattern that, to modern understanding, signaled magma forcing its way upward within the volcanic system. For the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum, the constant quakes were disruptive but not extraordinary. Contemporary accounts indicate they were treated as nuisances, not warnings. Buildings groaned, walls shifted, and objects fell, but life pressed on. Markets continued, games were planned, taverns bustled. The mountain above them, green with vineyards and dotted with villas, gave no outward sign of fury. To those living in its shadow, the tremors were part of the cost of dwelling in a region both beautiful and bountiful. Pliny the Elder, stationed across the bay at Misenum as admiral of the Roman fleet, had long been interested in natural phenomena. His Naturalis Historia, a vast encyclopedia of knowledge compiled by the 70s AD, cataloged earthquakes and other wonders with meticulous attention. Yet even he, with his scientific curiosity, had no framework to identify the tremors of 79 AD as volcanic precursors. The Roman intellectual world, advanced in engineering, law, and philosophy, lacked the geology to connect earthquakes with eruptions. What was happening beneath Vesuvius remained invisible, not only to the eye but to thought itself. The persistence of tremors in August would later stand out in hindsight as the final warnings ignored. The ground beneath Pompeii was restless, the Sarno plain shifting, the very foundations of homes unsettled. Yet the city's inhabitants continued their preparations for the late summer season. Villas along the coast hosted guests, taverns prepared for trade, and the harvest neared. Wealthy Romans flocked to the Bay of Naples precisely because it was considered a place of retreat, a world of abundance and tranquility far from Rome's political turbulence. The tremors did little to alter this perception. Religion offered the framework through which such events were interpreted. A series of small earthquakes might be read as displeasure from the gods, requiring sacrifice or ritual to appease them. Temples, altars, and household shrines provided avenues for such responses. The Lararia within Pompeian homes bore offerings to protective spirits, prayers that domestic peace would continue despite the disturbances outside. Public ceremonies reinforced the sense that proper devotion could stabilize a world shaken by unseen forces. To connect the tremors to a geological chain of cause and effect was beyond Roman thought. To interpret them as divine communication was entirely consistent with their worldview. Archaeological evidence supports the atmosphere of constant repair in the years leading up to 79 AD. Wall inscriptions note construction still underway, frescoes replaced or left incomplete, and tools abandoned in homes mid-task. Buildings such as the Temple of Venus and sections of the Forum show signs of reconstruction halted, as if the city lived in a state of perpetual recovery. For inhabitants, these were the scars of the 62 AD earthquake still healing, not signals of another disaster imminent. The memory of that earlier calamity, though traumatic, may even have numbed sensitivity to the tremors of 79 AD. If the city had already endured such destruction and continued to thrive, why should new quakes be treated differently? The scientific reality, unrecognized at the time, was that Vesuvius had entered a phase of renewed activity. The earthquake of 62 AD marked a critical stage in the reawakening of the volcano, the crust above its magma chambers adjusting under mounting pressure. The continuing tremors in subsequent years were further evidence of instability, precursors in the geological record that signaled an eruption was building. Yet the inhabitants of Pompeii and Herculaneum, guided by religion, tradition, and habit, moved through their days unaware. The bay still glittered, the soil still yielded harvests, and the mountain still stood silent in its deceptive calm. The last days before August 24th, 79 AD, were filled with vibrations too frequent to ignore, yet too familiar to inspire fear. The city rattled, but the city endured. Markets opened, streets bustled, and homes filled with voices. The signs were there, in the ground, in the walls, in the constant shaking of everyday life. But without the language of geology, without the science to decode them, they remained signs without meaning, fragments of a warning unheeded, the quiet preludes to the eruption that would end it all. On the morning of August 24th, 79 AD, the Bay of Naples appeared as it always had. Markets opened, households prepared meals, and ships rested in the harbors. But by early afternoon, the mountain that had slept for centuries revealed its power in an instant. Vesuvius erupted with a violence that no one alive had ever witnessed. From its summit, a column of ash, pumice, and gas shot into the sky, rising with such force that Pliny the Younger, writing years later, described it as resembling a pine tree. Its trunk a towering column, its crown a vast cloud spreading outward in branches. He observed this from Misenum, across the bay, where he was staying with his mother and his uncle, Pliny the Elder, admiral of the Roman fleet. His testimony remains the only surviving eyewitness account of the eruption, preserved in letters to the historian Tacitus decades later. The eruption's first phase was dominated by what volcanologists now call a Plinian column, after Pliny's description. Within minutes, the mountain expelled a mixture of pumice and ash that climbed nearly 20 kilometers into the atmosphere, propelled by the immense pressure of gases released from the magma chamber. This column loomed over the region, visible to every settlement along the bay. For those in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabii, the familiar landscape was instantly transformed. The sky darkened, the sun obscured, the air filled with ash, choking and blinding, while pumice stones, some the size of fists, rained down relentlessly. Roofs collapsed under the weight, tiles shattered, courtyards filled with falling rock. Archaeological layers show that in Pompeii alone, pumice accumulated at a rate of 15 centimeters per hour, quickly burying streets and homes. Panic spread as the fallout intensified. Families rushed to gather belongings, carrying what they could: coins, jewelry, food, while others clung to their homes, hoping the storm would pass. The eruption was not a single explosion, but a process lasting nearly 24 hours, each stage escalating the danger. The first hours brought what seemed survivable: ash fall, pumice rain, tremors shaking the ground. Some took the chance to flee, moving south toward Stabii or west toward Naples. Roads, however, became treacherous. Ash turned surfaces slippery, pumice piled into drifts that blocked passage, and falling debris struck those who dared the open. Those who remained inside their homes faced different dangers. Ceilings buckled under the weight of accumulating pumice. Archaeological evidence shows many victims crushed beneath collapsed roofs, their bodies trapped in the very structures they sought for shelter. Pliny the Elder, across the bay, responded with action. As commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, he ordered ships prepared, intending both to investigate the phenomenon and to aid those endangered along the coast. His decision to sail towards Stabii, where his friend Pomponinus resided, placed him directly in the path of the eruption. Pliny the Younger recorded his uncle's determination. He was as much a natural philosopher as a naval officer, compelled to observe and to act. While Pliny the Elder's expedition belongs to the later stages of the eruption, his presence from the first hours illustrates how Roman responses varied. Some froze in terror, some fled, others sought to face the danger directly. By nightfall on August 24th, Pompeii was already unrecognizable. Archaeological layers show that up to 3 meters of pumice had buried the city by midnight. Those still alive endured constant tremors, falling rock, and the suffocating atmosphere. Fires broke out as oil lamps overturned and roofs crashed inward. The eruption's force carried pumice and ash across the bay, affecting towns as far as Capua and beyond. The sheer reach of the fallout demonstrates the eruption's magnitude. It was not merely a local event, but a regional catastrophe. The human response was varied and fragmented. Some sought refuge in courtyards, others huddled in cellars. Skeletal remains reveal groups of families attempting to stay together, often carrying valuables in small bundles, hopeful of eventual escape. Many clung to religious ritual, leaving offerings at household shrines in the final hours. For the Romans, without the concept of volcanology, the eruption could only be interpreted as divine wrath or cosmic upheaval. Yet, even in the chaos, life continued in fragments. Bread left baking in ovens, animals tethered in stables, merchants' scales abandoned mid-transaction. The archaeological record preserves these details with merciless clarity. Herculaneum experienced a different pattern in the first phase. While Pompeii was buried in pumice fall, Herculaneum, situated closer to the volcano's western flank, was spared the heaviest fallout during the initial hours. Instead, its streets filled with ash and lapilli, but not to the catastrophic depth of Pompeii. Many inhabitants likely believed they had escaped the worst, unaware of the pyroclastic surges that would come later and obliterate the town. This difference in impact between the two cities highlights the eruption's complexity, with wind direction playing a decisive role. The prevailing winds that day carried most of the pumice toward Pompeii, sealing its fate in the first phase of the disaster. Pliny the Younger's testimony captures both the spectacle and the terror. From Misenum, he saw the column rising, expanding outward, blotting out the sky. He described how the cloud shifted in color from white to dark as it drew earth and ash into its mass. His letters, written around 100 AD, are not dramatic embellishments but careful observations by a man recalling the precision of events. His words gave future historians and geologists the framework to understand the nature of the eruption, even as they preserved the immediacy of its horror. The psychological impact on those in Pompeii is evident in the archaeology. Doors were barricaded, treasures hastily gathered, livestock abandoned. In one home, the remains of a dog were found chained, buried alive as pumice rose around it. In another, amphorae of wine were left sealed, stacked in cellars. The eruption froze these moments, not in metaphor, but in fact. The eruption did not erase Pompeii. It captured it in its last instant of life. Every pumice layer, every collapsed roof, every skeleton entombed beneath rubble speaks to the reality of choices made in seconds as the disaster unfolded. As August 25th dawned, the eruption had not ended. The pumice fall slowed, but by then, the city was already buried in meters of debris. Those who had survived the first night faced a landscape altered beyond recognition. Roads were impassable, buildings broken, air heavy with dust and ash. The eruption's second phase, pyroclastic surges, was imminent, though no one could know it. For Pompeii, the first stage alone had sealed its fate, collapsing its architecture, suffocating its inhabitants, and entombing its streets. The eruption had begun not with fire, but with stone falling from the sky, a rain of pumice and ash that transformed a living city into a suffocating grave. By the early hours of August 25th, 79 AD, the eruption entered its most lethal stage. The colossal column of ash and pumice that had towered above Vesuvius the previous day, rising nearly 20 kilometers into the atmosphere, could no longer support its own weight. Gravity seized it, and with the collapse came one of the most catastrophic volcanic events known to history, the pyroclastic surges. These were not rivers of lava, but avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and pulverized rock, moving at speeds faster than any person could run, temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, dense enough to suffocate, yet light enough to sweep across the land like a storm front of fire and ash. The first surges barreled down the western slope toward Herculaneum. This seaside town, spared much of the pumice fall that had crushed Pompeii the previous day, was struck with devastating suddenness. The surge rolled into the city with almost no warning. In moments, streets, villas, and waterfronts were overwhelmed. Archaeological remains show that the heat was so intense that wooden beams instantly carbonized, roofs ignited, and human tissue vaporized. The people of Herculaneum, many of whom had fled toward the shoreline, were killed in an instant. On the ancient beach, more than 300 bodies have been uncovered, huddled together in vaulted stone chambers once used for storing boats. Mothers clasped children, men shielded their faces, entire families crouched against the walls. They did not die buried in ash, but seared by temperatures that could kill before a single breath was drawn. Their bones show evidence of cracking from thermal shock, their skulls fractured by sudden expansion from within. Herculaneum was silenced in less than a minute. The surges did not stop there. Vesuvius sent them repeatedly down its slopes, 6 major surges in total, each more destructive than the last. When the column collapsed fully, the energy released was beyond anything the Roman world could comprehend. Pompeii, already weighed down by several meters of pumice and ash from the previous day, now faced annihilation. The first surges, slowed slightly by distance, reached the outskirts, carrying suffocating gases that robbed survivors of breath. Some managed to cling to life in the intervals between waves, but each surge brought heavier devastation. By dawn, the 4th and 5th surges penetrated deep into Pompeii's heart. Buildings buckled, upper stories crumbled, walls caved inward. Ash poured into open spaces, filling rooms, crushing bodies already trapped within. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath the advancing current. The last attempt at resistance, families crouched in corners, hands lifted in desperate prayer, was useless against the density of the flows. Excavations show the frozen forms of victims, their mouths open, arms curled, asphyxiated or overcome by heat in final moments of unbearable swiftness. The pyroclastic currents were not uniform. They shifted with wind and terrain, hitting Pompeii in successive blows. Archaeologists have traced their deposits. Layers of fine ash and hardened tuff intermingled with pumice, marking the precise sequence of each surge. The people who tried to flee at this stage never made it beyond the gates. On the roads leading out of Pompeii, skeletons lie tangled in groups, caught mid-flight, carrying valuables they thought they could save. In one case, a soldier's body was found with weapons and coins still strapped to his belt, a futile attempt to carry duty and wealth into death. Inside the city, bodies tell the tragedy in detail. In the house of the golden bracelet, a family was found, 2 adults and 2 children, buried together beneath the ash, the mother still adorned with a heavy golden bracelet weighing nearly a half kilogram, from which the house takes its modern name. In another location, plaster casts preserve the forms of victims who had crawled into cellars or pressed themselves into corners, waiting for air that never came. Their poses are not theatrical but anatomical truth, their final gasps captured in stone. The surges that buried Pompeii differed from the instant annihilation at Herculaneum. They suffocated before they incinerated. The flows filled lungs with toxic gases, suffused the air with fine ash, and pressed upon the chest with suffocating weight. Death came within moments, but in those moments, terror left its trace in the position of every limb and the tilt of every head. The pyroclastic flows did not simply bury a city, they embalmed its people in the raw posture of death. By late morning on August 25th, the last surges consumed what little still stood. Pompeii was gone, entombed beneath 4 to 6 meters of hardened volcanic material. Herculaneum was buried even deeper, under 20 meters of compacted tuff. The Bay of Naples, once a glittering hub of Roman luxury, had been reshaped in a single night of violence. The eruption had killed thousands, erased entire communities, and left landscapes unrecognizable. Yet in doing so, it preserved what it destroyed. Walls, mosaics, frescoes, bread loaves, oil lamps, all sealed in layers of ash and pumice, a time capsule formed by catastrophe. The human cost remains the most haunting evidence. More than 1,000 bodies have been uncovered in Pompeii, and hundreds more in Herculaneum. Their preservation is not accident, but consequence of the flows. Ash hardened around them, capturing voids where their bodies once lay. In the 19th century, archaeologists poured plaster into these cavities, creating casts that show the curled fingers, the twisted limbs, the silent faces of those who could not escape. These are not sculptures, but impressions of life interrupted. They show Romans not as distant figures in marble and bronze, but as individuals caught mid-movement, mid-breath, mid-prayer. The eruption ended as suddenly as it began. After some 24 hours, Vesuvius fell quiet, its fury spent. The column dissipated, the flows ceased, and silence reclaimed the Bay of Naples. Where Pompeii and Herculaneum had stood, there were only hills of ash and hardened debris. Those who had escaped returned later to find no trace of their homes. Towns that once thrived with trade, laughter, and ritual were simply gone. Vesuvius had not only killed, it had rewritten the geography of the region, pushing shorelines outward with new deposits, reshaping valleys, and altering the very face of the coast. What remains today is not ruin, but suspension. The pyroclastic flows, in their violence, created a paradox. They destroyed with such speed and completeness that they preserved at the same time. The architecture of homes, the contents of shops, the food left on tables, the prayers whispered in final breaths, all endured because of the same surges that brought death. In this lies the cruel precision of the eruption of 79 AD. It annihilated with such efficiency that it froze an entire world in its final heartbeat. When the eruption of Vesuvius ended on August 25, 79 AD, the violence of its convulsions left not just cities destroyed, but landscapes rewritten. The Bay of Naples, one of the most fertile and densely settled regions of the Roman Empire, had been altered in a single night. Geography was no longer what it had been the morning before. The force of the pyroclastic surges, the collapse of the eruption column, and the torrents of volcanic debris had buried towns, swallowed coastlines, and shifted the very outline of the shore. What the survivors returned to was not simply devastation. It was a world rendered unrecognizable. Herculaneum, once perched gracefully on the coastline, was erased beneath an avalanche of volcanic mud flows. The pyroclastic surges that descended upon the town mixed with groundwater, creating lahars, slurries of ash, water, and debris that hardened into concrete like tuff. Entire neighborhoods, colonnades, and gardens were sealed beneath nearly 20 meters of solidified volcanic rock. The city's position by the sea vanished. The coastline itself had been pushed outward hundreds of meters by the new volcanic deposits. The harbor, once the lifeline of Herculaneum's economy and identity, lay buried beneath hardened layers that preserved but suffocated the waterfront. What had been a bustling maritime community was now sealed beneath a tomb of geological force. Pompeii's fate was different, but no less final. While Herculaneum was encased in volcanic mud, Pompeii was suffocated beneath layers of pumice and ash. Over the course of the eruption, the city was buried under 4 to 6 meters of tephra. Roofs collapsed under the relentless weight of pumice stones. Walls were crushed by surging flows, and streets were filled until they disappeared beneath a hardened blanket. When the eruption ceased, Pompeii was no longer visible, its outline erased, its gates buried, its landmarks smothered. From a distance, there was no longer a city on that plain, only a gray, uneven mound stretching across what had once been a thriving urban landscape. The coastline itself bore scars of violent change. The pyroclastic flows and lahars charged into the sea, displacing water, reshaping harbors, and extending the shoreline. Where once the waters of the Bay of Naples had lapped against the walls of Herculaneum, new ground now stretched far into the bay, created not by slow centuries of sedimentation, but by a single day of catastrophe. The sea retreated, not naturally, but because it had been forced back by tons of volcanic material pouring into its depths. The Roman harbors that had once serviced fleets and traders were obliterated, their wharves buried beneath hardened tuff, their entrances blocked by the very mountain they had depended on. The fertile plains that had defined Campania were smothered under ash. This region had been famed throughout the empire for its vineyards, its olive groves, its grain fields nourished by volcanic soil. The eruption transformed that fertility into barrenness overnight. Ash-covered fields in layers thick enough to render them useless, smothering crops and killing livestock. The once lush land that fed Rome with wine and oil now lay gray and inert. Farmers who survived returned to find not land to cultivate, but wasteland to abandon. Archaeological evidence shows that the agrarian economy of the region did not recover for decades. Some areas were left uninhabited for centuries. The human memory of geography itself was shattered. Cities disappeared from maps, swallowed not by conquest, but by geology. Pompeii ceased to exist in the consciousness of later generations. The towns around the bay shifted their centers, built anew, and moved forward, leaving the lost cities beneath their feet forgotten. Inscriptions, records, and oral memory eventually faded, until what had once been Pompeii and Herculaneum became nothing more than faint references in scattered texts, their true locations erased. The eruption had not only obliterated the physical cities, but severed them from memory. Even the Bay of Naples, so admired by Roman elites for its beauty and luxury, was altered in ways that redefined its identity. Villas once perched along the shore with commanding views of the sea were gone, either buried under layers of volcanic debris or left stranded far from the water by the outward march of the new coastline. Maritime routes that had tied the bay to wider networks of Mediterranean trade had to adapt to new geography. The eruption had broken the rhythm of a region once celebrated as one of the empire's most prosperous, replacing it with a landscape of absence and silence. The layering of geological deposits reveals the force of the transformation. At Pompeii, archaeologists record alternating strata, pumice from the initial Plinian phase, then ash and tuff from the surges, each layer compacted into hardened stone. At Herculaneum, the sequence shows volcanic mud, multiple pyroclastic deposits, and thick flows that filled in every open space. These were not gentle accumulations, but rapid and suffocating floods that overwhelmed structures and redefined elevations. Modern excavation has revealed streets and houses preserved like fossils, entombed in place because the landscape itself had been rewritten above them. The scale of burial meant that the eruption did more than devastate, it concealed. Centuries passed, and fields were planted over what had once been city streets. New settlements rose nearby, unaware of the ruins beneath them. The transformed geography hid not only structures, but entire histories. Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other smaller towns such as Stabii and Aplantis vanished from view, absorbed into the altered ground. The reshaped coastline, the new volcanic ridges, and the hardened plains stood as mute monuments to the eruption, even as the memory of the towns they entombed evaporated. The magnitude of this change can be measured by its permanence. The coastline created by the eruption remained fixed for centuries, shaping the development of later communities. The agricultural barrenness lingered long after the ash fell, disrupting economic life and redistributing population. The destruction of urban centers left gaps in the urban network of Campania that were never entirely filled. The Bay of Naples had been a jewel of Roman prosperity, a region where emperors and elites built villas, where trade flowed easily, and where agriculture flourished on volcanic soil. In 79 AD, it was remade into a graveyard of stone, ash, and silence. The landscape was not merely altered, it was captured in an entirely new form. What had been vibrant cities and fertile plains became stratified layers of hardened debris. What had been a coastline alive with ports and harbors became an immovable frontier of volcanic tuff. What had been among the empire's richest lands was stripped bare, leaving only traces sealed beneath the hardened skin of the earth. The eruption of Vesuvius, in its final act, had done more than kill. It had transformed the very canvas on which life in Campania had been painted, ensuring that for centuries the land itself bore testimony to its violence. For centuries after the eruption of 79 AD, the names of Pompeii and Herculaneum faded from living memory. The towns that had once thrived under the shadow of Vesuvius were not erased from existence, but buried so completely that their locations became uncertain. Ancient authors such as Tacitus and Cassius Dio referred to the disaster, and Pliny the Younger's 2 letters to Tacitus preserved an eyewitness account, but the geography shifted, memory dimmed, and what lay beneath the hardened ground was no longer known. Medieval travelers passed over the fields above Pompeii, without suspecting the ruins beneath. At Herculaneum, buildings were occasionally struck by wells and foundations, fragments of marble or inscriptions surfaced, but these were regarded as curiosities rather than signs of an entire city sealed below. The catastrophe had succeeded not only in destroying, but in concealing, and for nearly 1,700 years the world above continued in ignorance. The first stirrings of rediscovery came not from historical interest, but from chance. In 1594, Workmen digging a canal in the Sarno Valley came across walls, inscriptions, and artifacts. They had struck Pompeii, though the site was not yet recognized as such. Pieces were noted, some were collected, but no systematic attempt was made to recover the buried city. The ruins were treated as incidental obstructions, stones to be cleared rather than windows into the past. In 1709, more significant remains appeared when a farmer sinking a well at Racina struck the ancient theater of Herculaneum. Marble statues, columns, and inscriptions emerged, drawing the attention of antiquarians. Unlike Pompeii, Herculaneum lay buried beneath more than 20 meters of solidified volcanic material, making excavation arduous. Yet the wealth of finds hinted at the magnitude of what remained below. The real turning point came under the Bourbon rulers of Naples. In 1738, King Charles of Bourbon, later Charles III of Spain, ordered systematic excavations at Herculaneum. Tunnels were driven through the hardened tuff, pulling out sculptures, bronzes, and fresco fragments. These works were celebrated, collected, and sent to royal collections, particularly the newly founded Museo Herculanense. The early excavations were not archaeology in the modern sense. They were treasure hunts directed by royal interest, seeking statues and art to glorify the Bourbon dynasty. Walls were destroyed, contexts lost, but objects of immense value were retrieved. Still, the presence of an entire Roman city entombed beneath modern ground was undeniable. Pompeii, lying beneath softer layers of ash and pumice, was opened shortly after. In 1748, systematic excavation began under the engineer Joaquin de Alcubierre, who had already been directing the Herculaneum works. Unlike Herculaneum, Pompeii was buried in a form that preserved structures above ground level. Streets, houses, temples, and amphitheaters emerged as tunnels gave way to open-air digging. Here, the ruins were not just sources of portable art, but whole architectural spaces frozen in time. Painted walls, mosaics, everyday utensils, and even graffiti came to light. The Bourbon kings realized that what had been unearthed was not a fragment, but an intact city sealed in its last moment of life. The excavations of the 18th century coincided with the Enlightenment, when Europe was hungry for knowledge of antiquity. The ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum became objects of fascination, visited by aristocrats and intellectuals on the Grand Tour. Goethe, visiting in 1787, described Pompeii as giving a truer impression of antiquity than any literary source. For the first time, a Roman city could be walked through rather than reconstructed in imagination. Streets still paved with basalt, houses still bearing painted names, and shops still stocked with amphorae offered a tangible, immediate contact with the past. The Bourbon rulers carefully curated access, sometimes limiting foreign scholars, but the fame of the excavations spread across Europe. The techniques of these early excavations were destructive by modern standards. Tunnels cut recklessly, frescoes removed from walls, mosaics pried up from floors, artifacts carried to Naples, while structures were left exposed to weathering. Yet even in their flawed methods, the excavators revealed something unprecedented: urban life preserved in situ. At Herculaneum, the theater, basilica, and villa of the papyri yielded sculptures, and, in the case of the villa, carbonized papyrus scrolls, the only library to survive from the ancient world. At Pompeii, the streetscape unfolded. Bakeries with mills still standing, thermopolia with counters intact, villas with frescoes blazing in red, yellow, and blue. Unlike ruins elsewhere in Europe, these were not shattered fragments, but intact environments. The 19th century brought advances in technique. Giuseppe Fiorelli, who took charge of excavations in 1863, introduced systematic recording, stratigraphic awareness, and preservation strategies. It was Fiorelli who developed the plaster cast method. When voids left by decomposed bodies were found in the hardened ash, plaster was poured in to capture the forms of the victims in their final moments. These casts revealed gestures of flight, prayer, or despair with a stark immediacy that stunned the world. For the first time, the human cost of the eruption was seen in three-dimensional detail. Pompeii ceased to be an abstract ruin and became a place of human tragedy preserved forever in the earth. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, excavations expanded. Entire districts of Pompeii were uncovered: the Forum, amphitheater, baths, and residential quarters. Houses such as the House of the Faun, the Villa of the Mysteries, and the House of the Vetii revealed masterpieces of Roman domestic decoration, with frescoes and mosaics preserved in their original settings. Streets unfolded in sequence, showing not only monumental architecture, but also the modest dwellings of artisans and shopkeepers. Inscriptions recorded business transactions, political slogans, and personal messages, granting historians a rare view into the daily life of an ordinary Roman city. Herculaneum, more difficult to excavate, was gradually opened by clearing away the hardened volcanic rock. Its preservation proved, in some respects, even more extraordinary than Pompeii. Organic materials, wooden furniture, doors, even food, survived carbonized but intact. In the 1980s, excavations at the ancient shoreline revealed boat houses filled with skeletons of hundreds of people, huddled together where they had fled seeking safety by the sea. The moment of death had been sealed so completely that nearly 2 millennia later, it could still be reconstructed with precision. Archaeology at both cities developed into a science rather than a treasure hunt. Stratigraphy, conservation, and interdisciplinary research transformed the sites into laboratories of Roman history. Frescoes, mosaics, and inscriptions were no longer removed wholesale, but studied in their contexts. Human remains were analyzed for age, health, diet, and trauma. Amphorae were examined for residues of oil, wine, and fish sauce. The ruins became not just relics, but data, reconstructing the economic, social, and cultural fabric of Roman life. The rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum reshaped the modern understanding of antiquity. While Rome and Athens had provided monuments and texts, these cities offered everyday life frozen at a single catastrophic moment. Archaeologists, historians, artists, and travelers were confronted not with ruins weathered by centuries, but with streets, houses, and possessions still where they had been in 79 AD. The rediscovery, beginning in the 18th century and continuing into the present, created an archive unlike any other, a record of Roman society, preserved not by design but by disaster. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD did more than obliterate cities. It created a record unlike any other in the history of archaeology. Pompeii and Herculaneum, entombed beneath layers of pumice, ash, and volcanic mud, were not reduced to fragments, but preserved almost intact, caught at the precise moment when life was interrupted. No other ancient site offers the same immediacy. In Pompeii, wall paintings remain vibrant. Political slogans scrawled on plaster walls are still legible, and bread loaves carbonized in ovens still bear the marks of the baker's blade. In Herculaneum, wooden doors hang on hinges, beds and shelves remain in rooms, and scrolls, though blackened, survived as the only complete ancient library known to exist. These sites transformed the study of Roman life, shifting it from the reconstruction of texts and ruins to direct observation of a society at work, at leisure, and in crisis. The lessons extend beyond the art and architecture of Rome. They speak of human vulnerability before forces that cannot be controlled. The citizens of Pompeii and Herculaneum were not ignorant of the mountain's power. Seismic activity had shaken the region before, most dramatically in 62 AD, when a violent earthquake devastated much of Pompeii. Repairs and reconstructions were still underway 17 years later when the eruption came. Yet to those living in the shadow of Vesuvius, the mountain was part of the landscape, its slopes fertile, its proximity offering prosperity through vineyards, agriculture, and trade routes across the Bay of Naples. That prosperity also created complacency. When the mountain split open on August 24, 79 AD, sending a column of ash and pumice 20 kilometers into the sky, those who stayed did not do so in ignorance, but in miscalculation. The Roman world had no frame of reference for a disaster of this magnitude. The cities buried by Vesuvius became a warning written in stone and ash. They remind historians and scientists of how fragile human settlements are in the face of nature's extremes. Volcanic eruptions are sudden, violent, and capable of erasing centuries of human effort within hours. Archaeological research at Pompeii and Herculaneum is not only about reconstructing Roman life, but about understanding how societies respond to catastrophe, how memory fades, and how landscapes themselves are reshaped beyond recognition. The coastline of the Bay of Naples shifted, harbors were obliterated, and fertile plains were smothered. What had been centers of trade and culture vanished from the maps of antiquity. For nearly 1,700 years, they remained forgotten, a silence that speaks to the capacity of nature not only to destroy but to conceal. The legacy of Vesuvius is also bound to the present, for the volcano has never been silent. It is not a relic of the past, but an active force looming over modern Naples, one of the most densely populated metropolitan regions in Europe. More than 3 million people live within reach of its slopes, in towns and cities built across the fertile volcanic soil that has always drawn settlers back despite the risk. Since 79 AD, Vesuvius has erupted more than 30 times, with varying intensity. In 1631, an eruption killed more than 4,000 people, sending torrents of mud and lava down its sides. In 1906, it erupted again, claiming over 100 lives and blanketing Naples with ash. The last eruption occurred in March 1944, during the Second World War, when lava destroyed several villages and damaged Allied air bases around Naples. Since then, the volcano has been classified as dormant but not extinct, and volcanologists regard it as one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world due to the dense population at its base. The risks are not theoretical. Italy's Civil Protection Department maintains detailed evacuation plans, and scientists constantly monitor seismic activity, gas emissions, and ground deformation around the crater. The fear is not of another minor eruption, but of one on the scale of 79 AD, a Plinian eruption capable of releasing pyroclastic surges that would give residents little time to escape. Modern technology provides tools the Romans never had: early warning systems, hazard maps, and emergency protocols, but the human vulnerability remains. The fertile land, the strategic location, and the centuries of settlement mean that millions remain in harm's way. The lesson of Pompeii and Herculaneum, written in plaster casts of the dead and in the preserved remnants of their lives, is not confined to antiquity but speaks directly to the present. Yet it is not only danger that keeps the story of Vesuvius alive. The fascination with Pompeii and Herculaneum lies in their uniqueness as archaeological time capsules. They have no parallel. Ancient Rome can be studied through its monuments in the capital, its inscriptions across the empire, its literature preserved through centuries, but nowhere else can an entire city be walked through as if its inhabitants had just stepped out. The suddenness of the destruction ensured that objects remained in place. Amphorae still stand in bars, tools rest in workshops, and frescoes remain on dining room walls. These traces collapse the distance of 2 millennia. They provide a view into the lives of ordinary people as well as elites, from bakers and innkeepers to senators and priests. The graffiti on Pompeian walls reveal humor, rivalry, politics, and love in words scrawled casually by citizens who never imagined they would be preserved. The rediscovery of Pompeii in 1748 and Herculaneum in 1738 not only advanced archaeology, but reshaped European culture. The art and architecture uncovered inspired neoclassicism, influencing painters, architects, and designers across the continent. Frescoes from Pompeii were copied and studied, their colors and motifs entering palaces and salons from Paris to St. Petersburg. The casts of victims shocked and fascinated visitors, forcing them to confront death frozen in time. Writers such as Edward Bulwer-Lytton turned Pompeii into a symbol in literature, a backdrop for stories about decadence, catastrophe, and memory. Historians and archaeologists, from Fiorelli in the 19th century to modern specialists in volcanology, have continued to treat the cities as unparalleled sources, not only for Roman studies but for the history of disaster itself. The legacy of Vesuvius therefore operates on several levels. It is a scientific case study, a cultural reference point, an archaeological treasure, and an ever-present hazard. The volcano's eruptions remind humanity of its limits in the face of geological forces that operate on scales larger than civilizations. The ruins it created continue to inform, inspire, and unsettle. The fascination endures because the cities were not allowed to decay over centuries. They were stopped in a single day, preserving the ordinary as well as the monumental. That moment, sealed beneath meters of ash and pumice, remains both a gift to history and a warning to the present. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum live on not through their writings or monuments, but through the physical remnants of their interrupted lives. The plaster casts show bodies contorted in their final moments, but the walls around them show paintings of gods, myths, and gardens. The shops display the goods of everyday trade. The theaters stand ready for performance. These are not reconstructions, but direct transmissions from antiquity. Every excavation, every fresco, every inscription continues to add to the archive of Roman life preserved by disaster. Vesuvius, silent for now, towers above modern Naples as both creator and destroyer, a reminder of the fragility of human achievement and the endurance of the natural forces that shape history.